Good morning, everyone. There we are. Hi. My name is Kelly Shushock, and I am the grateful pastor here at Edges. I'd like to welcome you today. It's really great to see all the faces. It's the time when all things begin to pick up in Blacksburg. Lots of things are new. Lots of things are picking up. I've been singing that I Surrender song all week long. Have any of you tried to go to the grocery store? Yeah, you surrendered, right? Totally. And then yesterday we had a friend come in from out of town. She didn't know it was move-in. Like 3 hours it took us to get breakfast. We were all just like, I surrender. I mean, it's lunch. We're not even hungry for breakfast anymore. But the worst was, some of you know I have a sophomore in college son this year, and so I took he and his roommate to Walmart. Mistake. And because they're moving into an unfinished apartment. So we had not one cart but two. And in one cart, most everything was technology. And in the other cart, most everything was cleaning supplies. So after like an hour and a half in Walmart, we're waiting for like 45 more minutes in the checkout line. We finally decided to self-checkout our 362 items just so we could get out. And we get there, and we have one cart. Guess which one it was? The technology cart. The cleaning supply cart was somewhere in the store. They just left it. They were not at all interested in the cleaning supply cart. So I surrender all. That's the theme. And I come to Edges every week to remember that there's a bigger theme, right? That there's a bigger thing to surrender to, and it really does matter. And I can't remember it on my own in weeks like this when there seems to be lots of excitement and lots of chaos. So I'm glad to be here this morning. This is actually the second week in a 4-week series. It's called Floored. You may have seen the graphic someplace this week. We're talking about things that keep us grounded. It seemed like a good way to start a new year with what is it that helps us to stay grounded. We're talking about what God promises can be a floor under our lives that will hold us up. I mentioned last week that I think a series like this is just another one of the many reasons that people really do need a God. Because if you don't have a God to help you know what wisdom is, then it's pretty flimsy what you're going to build your life on. And I don't think you can build a whole life on flimsy. So we have to think about what are the real things. Last week we talked about how worship is one floor that God puts underneath our living. Worship is one choice that we can make that will help hold us up. Learning what it is to know and to be known by God, that will help keep us grounded. It will help keep us from free falling. That's the way I was looking for it. So what are the things that help us have a solid perspective, a place to stand, a floor underneath our lives? Today, essentially what we're going to be thinking about is change. I don't know if many of us would think about change being a floor underneath our living. So I'd like to just sort of gently ask us to wade in. I want to start with this quote by a guy whose name is Norman Mailer. I imagine many of you haven't heard of him. He's known for creating this genre called creative nonfiction. He's kind of a fascinating guy. Here's how he thinks about change. He says, every moment of one's existence, one is growing into more or retreating into less. One is always living a little more or dying a little bit. In a related tangent, sort of, many of you are not old enough to know the movie Tommy Boy. But look, some of you are. So Tommy Boy came out in 1995. I don't know if you remember the movie, but there's this larger-than-life character in it whose name is Big Tom Callahan, and he has this moment in the movie, which you're going to remember when I say it, where Big Tom Callahan says, "You're either growing or you're dying. There ain't no third direction." One of the many ways the Bible talks about this same theme is like this. Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed. So I'd like to start with a question. What's the difference between living a little more and dying a little bit? Now, that is a hard question. Sometimes at Edges, we talk about things in groups, especially when the questions are hard. So that's the first question I'm going to ask us to talk about together today. I'd like to just notice that the room is full. So I'm going to ask you to get in groups of about 5 or 6 people. If you've been here before and you know the drill, try to make sure you've got a couple of new folks who are in your group. And for everybody, it's always fine to talk or listen, whichever you feel comfortable with in a group setting. We're going to have about 3 minutes to talk about this question. But especially if there are people in your group who you haven't met before, as there should be, please make sure you know each other's names at least so that you can maybe have some more conversation later. The question is, what's the difference between living a little more and dying a little bit? See what you think about it when you talk together, and go. All right. Oh, people are saying no, you need more time. Okay. It's time to surrender, everybody. All right, there you go. All right, that's no small question. Whenever there's like a real big thing to talk about, we try to talk about it together. Because if you just hear it, I don't know, usually that's the kind of stuff that goes away. The question was, what's the difference between living a little more or dying a little bit? If you heard a soundbite in your group that you think would be helpful for the conversation together, would you just say it out loud? What's the difference between living a little more and dying a little bit?
We talked about how growth isn't necessarily limited to doing positive things in your life. That even if you're doing something that's negative, you're still going to initially grow that through experiential learning.
Okay, so you can get experiential learning from things that are positive and negative. That growth isn't always just through things that we perceive to be positive. Sure. Okay. What else? Perspective. Who said that? Somebody back over here? Okay. Perspective is a big part of the difference between living a little more and dying a little bit. Okay, sure. The way you see it, how you view what's happening, maybe even positive or negative things, sure. Having a purpose. Okay, so living a little more is possible when we have a purpose. Okay. What else? Thank you. Dying a little bit isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes some things need to die a little bit so that you can have some more space for things to grow. Sure. Dying a little bit could be like being complacent. So maybe dying a little bit can be just complacency where you're doing things in a mundane or a rote kind of way instead of learning to live your life. Sure. Okay, so fear and comfort as a mix of those two things. How is fear playing in either dying or living a little bit? And how is comfort playing a part in the choices that we make? Sure. Identifying an opportunity, okay? So identifying an opportunity can play a role in helping us live a little more. Sure. Okay, living a little more may require effort, and dying a little bit may not always require our effort. Sure.
Actually, the word dying reminds me of dying to self. You know, what we'll talk about in a moment, and I find that very hard.
Yeah.
To die to self and to be able to focus on others.
Yeah, okay, so dying to self is the way that Sherry interpreted part. It reminded her of that dying to self and having them focus on others, that sometimes there's a big difficulty in that. Sure. Good questions as we begin our topic together this morning. I'd just like to posit that I think the biblical writers think that living a little more is a choice that is open to us. That living a little more is a choice that is open to us. And I think the biblical writers think that this is a choice that God hopes we will make every day. That God hopes we will sign on for every day. I want to see if you can hear now some practical wisdom for how we can make that choice from a book that Paul actually wrote, the book of Romans. He wrote it to a church that was gathered in Rome. The chapter we'll be looking at is Romans chapter 12, and it's on page 652. If you'd like to look at it in the Bibles that are on your table. You don't have to do that. It'll appear before you on the screen. I just really wanted to emphasize that I looked up the page number today. That's mostly what that was about. All right. So here, as I've said, Paul's writing to a church full of people who are struggling. They are straddling this fence that I called change earlier. And Paul wants them to know that it's possible to actually choose growth. Not for it just to happen to us, but for us to choose growth instead of death. Listen. So, Paul says, brothers and sisters, because of God's mercies, I encourage you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice that is holy and pleasing to God. This is your appropriate priestly service. Don't be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you can figure out what God's will is, what is good and pleasing and mature. All right. So there's this fence these guys are straddling, as I've mentioned, because Paul's talking about it. See it there in verse 2, where Paul says, don't be conformed to the patterns of the world, but be transformed. You see the fence? Don't step on this side, step on this side. Here, Paul is suggesting that transformation is possible. And again, that every living thing is always changing. Every living thing, not even just humans. You can see this again in nature, like we talked about last week. But Paul's saying that transformation is possible and that we can initiate the kind of change when we choose the transformation that God is already offering. And that when we do that, look at the text, we can figure out what God's will is. What's good and pleasing and mature. Or fully orbed. What makes a life whole. Transformation is how we begin to see the kinds of possibility that are available in this world that God sees. Participating in transformation. All right, how then? Well, I think there's still more wisdom to be found even inside this text. Look in verse 1 with me. The text says, because of God's mercies, I, that's Paul, encourage you to present your bodies as a living sacrifice that's holy and pleasing to God. So Paul's saying, because of who God is, because of God's mercies, not because of who you are. This has nothing to do with you. It's because of who God is, you can trust God with your life. You can't be trusted always, but God can be. So you can trust God with your life, and every day you can choose to do that. And God will be so happy to help you live a little more. Do you see? It'll be holy and pleasing to God. God will be so happy to help you live a little more, to transform you, to help you grow. So when you sign on, just know God already signed on, and God's going to keep signing on for helping you to live a little more every day. That's the promise. But if you read the whole text, this doesn't happen just because God wants it, just because it makes God happy, because God is gracious enough not to force anything on any of us, even good things. So the text seems to imply that we have to want it too. Transformation happens when we commit to what Paul calls the renewing of our minds. I'd like for us to think about that for the rest of our time. What in the world does it mean to renew our mind? How do you click the refresh button on your mind, on your thoughts? From the text, I'd like to suggest this thing I've called the transformation life cycle. It seemed educational, so I just thought it up. I made a little graph, drew it on a piece of paper, then I asked Megan if we could make a slide out of it, and you are about to see the slide. Are you ready? Here it comes. From the text, I think we can infer this is a transformation life cycle. You get to decide what you do with it. First, on the top right, decide to trust God's invitation. That's where Paul invites, present your bodies as a living sacrifice. Decide to trust God's invitation. And then 2, bypass stuff that helps you die a little bit. I want you to think about what that might be. Paul says, don't be conformed. Take a hard pass on anything that is the opposite of living. I'll talk some more about that in a moment. And then 3, on the upside, engage in stuff that'll help you live a little more. Paul says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So open your reasoner, and when you open it, expect your mind to change. I wonder if sometimes we think being a Christian means having a mind that never changes, like having something that's locked down. Not according to the Bible. So open up your mind, open up your reasoner, expect it to change, expand your thinking, grow your understanding of God's ideas. That's what the text says is part of the cycle. And then, thing 4, rest in the floor that comes underneath your life. Believe it or not, that's going to bring a floor underneath your life where you can figure out what God's will is, where you can know what it is that's pleasing, that's good, that's fully orbed. This is the way it happens. There are about 1 billion observations that I think we can make from this. I'd like to ask you to think about what a few of them are. When you think about actually applying this cycle in your real life tomorrow, what observations could you make? What observations would you make if you were really thinking about this cycle? And we're going to talk about that in groups for a few more minutes. So if you guys will just recollect with the people you were with, see what take 20 seconds and just look at the graph. I mean, both because it's beautiful and because you should think by yourself for a second first. What observations inside your own little mind? Okay, now go share some ideas with other people. Go. All right, guys, 30 seconds. All right, about 10 seconds. Whoever's talking, go ahead and finish it up. All right. That's it. Okay. So the cycle is what you were thinking about that time. The cycle that I think is taken straight from Romans 12 and from many other places in Scripture. What kind of observations can you make about if you were really going to try to apply that cycle? What did you hear in your group? What's a sound bite that would be helpful for everybody to know before they think about applying it? Ah. Yeah. Okay, so Brian said that when you do one, you're also doing the other, or at least you should be. Yeah, one of the things we talk about in lots of our recovery programs is that you can't take something out without putting something else in its place. Sure. What else? Yeah. Yeah, so the text talks about placing all of your living. And so what Amy said is that it's not just a one-time thing. You don't like get it right or wrong once. This is a cycle that is over and over and over again. In the 8:30 worship, someone said it's just interesting how close rest is to trusting. Like you don't get much time after resting to decide you got to go try to trust again. You know, that it's sometimes the distance between those two is very, very short. What else? Okay, and in the same breath, there can be a large gap between the bypass and the engagement. It just takes time to get from one to the other. Sometimes it's not just a split moment. Sure.
Depending upon the circumstances, it might be something that's more challenging and something that's less challenging.
Yeah. Depending on the circumstances, one could be more challenging and the other less. And when the circumstances change, it might be exactly the opposite. Sure. All right. One more?
I think it's presented as you need to trust God and be patient before you can do anything else on the circle. But I think that on the converse of that, being able to do other stuff in the circle can help you trust God.
Yeah. Maybe you can enter the circle at any point. Christian said that the graph presumes that you have to trust God before you can do anything else in the circle, and that maybe doing some of the things in the circle can help you to trust God, that maybe there are other entry points on the circle. Sure. One thing I'd just like to point out that I think sometimes many churches, the only thing I feel like it's really okay for me to be critical about is the church, because it's the thing I represent. I think sometimes we get stuck in point two. We think that what being a Christian is about is undoing stuff. Is about bypassing stuff that's bad for us. And sometimes people who are trying to follow Jesus can get kind of a hyper focus on that, stopping number two. And it's just that if that's your only focus, you can get stuck at the bottom of the cycle. So something also to think about. But what we want to talk about today, and what I don't want to get stuck on today, is point two. How do you undo the stuff that's wrong? Instead, I want to talk about how do you do point three. How do you renew your mind? How do you engage the stuff that will help you live a little bit more? How do we really choose to grow instead of die? How do we click the refresh button on our reason? Because the text seems to suggest that matters a lot. That in order for transformation to happen, the renewing of our mind is the thing we've got to say yes to. How do we renew our minds? I would suggest that the way you always renew your mind, or at least one big way, is by giving it new content. Is by thinking about what is new content. So today I'd like to offer what I think are 3 good ideas for how you get new content, how you renew your mind, how you don't keep it in the same loop, how you actually engage in making transformation possible in your own life, and the result is that you get to rest in the peace that's God's. All right, 3 good ideas. The first one is called good people. By this, I mean people who are good for us. I do not mean that some people in the world are good and other people in the world are bad. I mean thinking about how you choose people who are good for you, people who can help you see what God is like. And before we go any farther in any of these ideas, I want to say there's a whole bunch of people and the other things I'm going to suggest that we don't get to choose. I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about the discretionary people that you have, the people that you do get to choose. To some extent, all of us choose our people. We don't choose all of our people, but we do get to choose some of them. And you're already doing this. We're all already doing this. So I'd like to invite you to look around your own life for a moment. Who are the people you are already choosing? Because that's the direction that you're headed. When you think about the ways that you can choose people in your life, who are they? The people that we choose, especially the ones we choose to offer our discretionary time, if they're good for us, they'll help us live a little more. Are your chosen people helping you grow? Are they helping you see what God sees? And here again, another little disclaimer. Just because somebody's a Christian person doesn't make them a good person for you. And just because someone isn't doesn't make them a bad person for you. All the world shows us who God is. How are we going to choose it? All right? So, just imagine that you have a little line graph, and this is your evaluation moment of yourself, and the title of the line graph is Good People, and there's a 1 on one side of a graph and the 5 on the other. Where would you place yourself just inside your head? How are you doing on this one? Good people. The second thing, I called it good texts. I don't mean like text with emojis. I mean, not those kind of texts. What I want to ask us about is, where do your words come from? What do you read? What do you listen to? What do you scour every day? And are those words or images good for you? When you can choose it, what is the quality of your input? Whatever it is, it's who you are becoming. It's helping you live a little more, or it's a life sucker for you. Whatever we read and see and watch and hear, whatever are our daily texts, that's our food. What kind of food is it? I asked Frank for permission to share this story. Some of you know Frank is my husband. And Frank listens to The Daily every morning. Do you know what that is? It's a podcast put out by the New York Times. It's 20 or 30 minutes long. They take some current issue and then go down a rabbit hole and talk about it for 20 or 30 minutes. Frank gets up, takes a shower, stands in front of the mirror, turns on The Daily, and listens to it. And from the other room, I hear, "Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh!" Every day for 20 or 30 minutes. He said I could share this as an example because something that's a good text for one person might be a bad text for another person. I'm not suggesting The Daily is or isn't. I'm just suggesting Frank should ask that question about his life. It's a text he has every day, and he should ask the question, is that helping Frank be more compassionate and empathic, to be more understanding, to think about social causes, to ask himself what his involvement is going to be in those? Or is it just making him pissed? I mean, is it just, or is he just cynical, It's making me pissed. No, I'm just kidding. It's not. Frank should ask the question about Frank's life. What are your texts? What are the things you see, hear, listen to? And are they good for you? Are they helping you to know anything about who you are, about who God is, and what your involvement is in becoming? And number 3, good laboratories. This is the second week in a row where I've used a science word, and I just would like for you to notice, that's all. A laboratory is where you do research. It's where you go to seek answers to your questions. A laboratory is a place where you can go to find help for healing. A laboratory can be a place where you find hope for what's hurting. Where do you locate yourself when you need those things? What are your actual laboratories? Where do you locate yourself as a learner? And especially, where do you go that refreshes your mind, that opens yourself to new possibilities about who God is or about who you will be? And especially, I'd like for you to think about when you're hurting, when you need healing, what's your laboratory? Because there is a good chance we all have some good laboratories and we all have some pretty unhealthy ones. And when you take your hypothesis to the wrong place, you're going to get a conclusion that doesn't add up. Where's a good spot to take your questions and to test your hypotheses? And quickly, I'd just like to say that laboratories, I think, are, of all of these, I mean, they're all cumulative, but laboratories especially are cumulative. You can't go to a laboratory one time, and if it feels like it didn't do anything for you, count it out. You can't. Laboratories are cumulative. In fact, just this morning, I was talking to one of the people who helps open the group called Circle of Hope. It meets here on Thursday evenings. It's a Narcotics Anonymous group. And the person I was talking to said to me, guess what? This week was 52 weeks. This group has been meeting in this building on Thursday night for the past 52 weeks. And I said, oh my gosh, you've been doing that for 52 weeks? I was thinking about the cumulative effect of that one whole year. And the convener said to me, no, it was 1 week, 52 times. How are you doing on this one? I don't think I asked it about the last one. Good text? So make your line graph for text in your head and laboratories and ask yourself, how are you doing? Are you closer to a 1? Are you closer to a 5? One final thing, this isn't in my notes, but I would just like to offer that if you're a parent, your kids didn't get to choose you, but you're helping create laboratories and people and texts. And the same thing is true if you have people that work with you, if you're a teacher, whoever you are, somebody is looking to you. And we get to help be good people. We get to help offer good texts, provide good laboratories. How are we doing? Because it's a lot easier to wake up every day and to choose people and texts and laboratories that are not going to help us know what is good, pleasing, and mature. That are not going to help us discover what God was dreaming about when God said at the beginning of this day, let's do it again. So if you know that you're dying a little bit, if you know that you're on the downward slope of transformation, maybe you need to evaluate whether some of your people, some of your texts, some of your laboratories are bad for you. But don't think, as was earlier mentioned, that you can just unchoose those. You can't. The better thing would be to choose to input the up arrow. The better thing would be to choose some that are good for you, even if for a time you can't unchoose the others. In these kinds of choices, we will find transformation. That's what the text promises, that we can choose growth, that we can choose real food. At Edges, this is a value that we call nurture. How do you choose the kind of food that grows you? And it's how we begin to know what God's dreams are. And that is the kind of breakthrough that puts a floor underneath a whole life. So let it be. Amen.